The Southeast Asian bloc, or ASEAN as its formal name, has become amongst the largest destinations in the entire developing world for foreign direct investments, or FDIs. In 2020, the 10-nation received a staggering $137 billion in FDI. The largest entity to have given these international investments in Southeast Asia, however, is not its neighboring Asian nations such as China or Japan, two countries that are relatively known to be ASEAN's largest investors, but hail all the way to the west, which is the United States. In 2020, the US was the forefront investor, registering over $35 billion, or 25.5% of the total investments ASEAN received during that year. Much more than China and Japan combined, after the two nations only invested around 14.7%. Furthermore, the US has a total stock of foreign direct investments in ASEAN worth over $328.5 billion, which is an investment amount that is close to the nominal gross domestic product of some nations in the 10 bloc. So how did the US end up choosing ASEAN among its primed investment destinations? Before we move on, don't forget to leave us a like and subscribe for more. The US and ASEAN's member states' modern history has been going on far longer before the association was even enacted, but its formal relations with ASEAN as a whole started in 1977 when the US was delegated as a dialogue partner. This paved the way for bilateral relations to increase with the US and ASEAN's member states, and because ASEAN's economy was on the rise, the US would see this as a golden opportunity. So by the 1990s, the US-ASEAN trade, business cooperation, investments, and even military treaties would rapidly increase. By 1995, the US's FDI inflows would reach around $28 billion. Likewise, the US would also be among the largest trade partners of the bloc. Come 2010, the US has established itself as a designated strategic partner that is outside ASEAN, after it signed several treaties such as the ASEAN-United States Trade and Investment Framework and the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia. Moreover, a year later, the US placed its first ever resident ambassador to ASEAN, which would further strengthen the two's bilateral relations. And with the rate of ASEAN's economic growth, the US foreign investments would flourish. From 2005, it had invested over $43 billion. By 2010, it had rose to $97 billion, more than doubling it in just 5 years. 2 years later, by 2012, it would stand to over $111 billion. Today, however, the US has a far larger presence in Southeast Asia. It has established itself as a source of aid, investments, technology transfer, education, and more important, trade. After all, in 2020, the US-ASEAN bilateral goods and service trade reached over $362.2 billion, which makes the US the key partner of ASEAN. Amongst the US investments, the most exciting stories that have happened recently are due to the continuous expansion of US-based firms. The enterprises have expanded into the ASEAN states either by mergers or acquisition, like when Netfin Acquisition bought off Triterra's FinTech for $1 billion in 2020, or through expansion. The most exciting that we have seen is ExxonMobil's multi-billion-dollar expansion plan in Singapore, Everwin's international manufacturing factor in the Philippines, Lam Research's wafer production facility in Malaysia, Taco Bell's retail store in Indonesia, and most probably one that may go down in history is Amazon's launch of its e-commerce platform in Singapore. After all, it is a nation filled with quite a tough competition. Furthermore, because of the recent China-US trade tension that has happened, there were several US firms that have moved their operations from China to ASEAN, such as Harley-Davidson, HP, Keytronic, Dell, and so on. The future of the US-ASEAN bilateral relations, on the other hand, is not as bright as we may think it is. First of all, China, Asia's largest economy and a presence that has become so large that nobody could ignore, is aggressively expanding into Southeast Asia, whether that is through trade or investments. According to China's Ministry of Commerce, the trade of ASEAN-China has rapidly increased. From 1991, when it had a total goods and service trade of only $8.36 billion, to 2020, when it had an enormous jump of over $685 billion. The increasing presence of China likewise may place the US far behind in terms of economic activity, while it had already done so with trade. To ensure that the US is still large in ASEAN, however, may lie in its continuous investments. After all, it is still the largest investor in the region, and it may need to do more to ensure its presence is still by far a large sum.